All right. So the first question I have is, I was showing you guys the stuff in the blog posts about how I approach things and what I use, like what's my mental process when I'm thinking about for, I'm mixing. And I didn't know if you guys have any questions that came out of the blog posts, because we can just start with a couple questions and then I'm going to move into my demo. So, and something I haven't gone over in the posts is my pigments. So before I jump into actually painting something, just to say, just like in the post, right? I'm often mixing. That's a pretty dirty yellow, but it's fine. And of course, on Zoom, all of this looks, it always looks funny. It looks a little more super saturated. Somebody, I don't know who it is, but you are unmuted and I can hear your papers rustling around. So for sure, when I'm learning a color, I mean, this is just ultramarine blue, right? So, and cad yellow. But when I get other pigments, like something new, 100%, I'm going through this process. I make all kinds of swatches. Because how else are you going to really know what you can get from your pigments, right? And of course, eventually you become really knowledgeable about your pigments, and that's true, but that comes out of experience. There we go. And then I'm going to bring this over. It's a little messy, but that's fine. So, and here we go. That's a pretty good little shift. And that's everything that I can get mixing cad yellow and ultramarine blue, right? And when we look on the artist's color wheel, right, it goes pretty much right along the edge of being a gray. And if I mix something else, here's that, just like I was talking about in the blog posts, here's cad lemon, right? A much cleaner, greener yellow. And here's cobalt teal blue. This is another green that I use a lot. It's almost a blue, right? And if we start swinging these over, what we're going to discover is that this is way on the outside of the wheel, right? It's definitely dodging the middle. So I'm just not going to get much that's muted. Just everything's going to be super vibrant. And sometimes we want that, but sometimes I don't want that, right? So this is a different mixing line. I'll be using this today. I'll be using this for really vibrant greens, and then I'll be using this when I drop in darker shades. And then if I want to take a color, like when I talk about using the rubber band method, we'll be going into this in the workshop, in depth, but just to say, if I take like this green in the middle and I bring it over here, let's get that to be a bigger pool. There's that green in the middle, right? So this is that. And I want to warm it up, right? Then I can take my orange and I can add a little bit of an orange to it, and it'll slowly become a kind of weird greeny brown. And it sounds so strange, but this is definitely a color that I use if I have like a pine tree and it's warmed up by the kind of light that's hitting it. So this is definitely a color that gets used. Or sometimes I'll have that same kind of muted green, right? This is kind of like this color here. And I need it to be even darker, right? So I'm going to add more burnt sienna, more ultramarine blue. I've got this really dark brown. Now I can actually add a yellow across the wheel, right? And I'm getting this really, really dark green. And if I want to, if I add water to it, I can see, oh, it's almost gray, right? So this kind of method where I'm starting with a not very clean color with a cad yellow or something, and then I'm going to have some other kind of color with it. And then across the wheel, I'm going to have another color over here. That's the method that I'm talking about doing, where what we're doing is mixing this across from the blue to the green, from the blue to the yellow. We get a series of greens. And then wherever I land, if I need to nudge it, I can grab a brown, I can grab an orange, whatever the case might be. And when I add it in, I'm pulling it like a little rubber band over here towards the warms, but it'd still be a green. And it works the other way too, just to say, right? Like if I mix a yellow and a blue together and I get this kind of muted green and I need it to be more vibrant. For example, I can add that teal blue to it, right? And I'm actually using the rubber band to pull it out to make it more green, less yellow, and out towards the outside of the color wheel, right? It's more vibrant now because I'm adding a blue that is a cleaner color, right? It's not as so dirty. It's not so close to the wheel, the middle of the wheel. So I can pull a color out towards the outside of the wheel, or I can use something on the opposite side of the wheel and I can pull a color into the middle of the wheel. And this is the way I'll be mixing all my greens today. So as I go through, I'll try and remember to talk about this and what I'm doing. But if you have a question, then please ask me, about my pigments and how I'm moving them around and what my choices are. I have on my palette today, I have cad yellow and cad lemon and cadmium yellow. And I usually keep my cadmium yellows in two wells. One I use to mix greens and one I use to mix warm colors. Cadmium orange, burnt sienna in two wells. I have something called Joe's Red. This is a quinacridone rose. I don't use these much, but I keep them on the palette because every once in a while I'll need them. This is a color called smalt blue. It's kind of a violet color, but I am out of it. I have two wells of ultramarine blue. I use them so much. I have cobalt blue, cobalt turquoise light. It is a color by Winsor Newton, and it's this lovely teal. This is Viridian. This is chromium oxide, which is a really opaque, muted green. And then this is Perylene green. Perylene green is not actually black. It actually has a green in it. If you mix it in with colors, it becomes obvious that it's very gently green, while also being really dark. So I'll be doing a lot of back and forth between my yellows and usually one of this set of blues, blue-greens, and then I'll be nudging it around using either a warm color like a burnt sienna or this orange or the cad yellow, or I might need to draw it back down into a shadow color. And so I'm going to pull it back on the mixing line towards one of these. All right. The way this goes. Okay. As pretty much I do 90% of the time, I am gonna, is that the cad yellow medium or light? Cad yellow light is what it is. But don't worry about muting yourself. So, because then other people will be able to hear you, and if they're not checking the chat roll, they can hear your question. What was that?
I said, okay, thank you.
No problem. All right. So I wet the back, and I wet the back of the paper. I drop my water onto the board itself, and this is going to help me be able to work my greens and all of my colors for longer. I give a little mist on the top. Stop. With my handy dandy kitchen mister. It's the best mister ever that I've ever had, for real. I love it. And I have my paper towel, which I use for little daubing needs. And then I always keep on my shoulder a little paint rag, and I often use this to daub off my paint brushes. So we have this scene. I'm looking over here at another computer. I have another scene with the rocks, right? And I actually have painted it, right? Already. So here's this. It looks so much better on the Zoom screen than it does in real life to me, but that's okay. We're gonna paint this scene again. So in real life, this is a little too muted, and there's not as much contrast as I would like. You'll see if I might post this tomorrow. I'm going to load up a recording of this, and when I do, I'll put this initial painting into the little post, and then I'll put in the final painting. But we want to create this feeling of light kind of coming in, and what we're going to do is this area here will be a yellowy mix, right? It's going to be paler in value, and it's going to, because it's going to be a yellowy green, and then it'll also be warmer, so it'll feel like sun. And then in here, we're going to mix in more blues, and we're going to create some shadow work around this. So we're just going to be creating, all the interest is going to come out of, you know, a warm green versus a cool green. It's going to be about, yes, it is cad yellow light. That's correct. It's going to be about warm versus cool greens, and the fact that they have different values. We'll have some white in here, particularly on the rock, to make the rock kind of pop. But the greens will be doing all the heavy lifting in terms of telling this story about it being a bright, warm, you know, summer day. All right. So, and we have this little version of it, right? So this, I'm going to be doing this on one of these little 8x8 pieces. I use 140-pound paper. So it's not 300, but it stays flat because it's wet underneath it, and it's saturating into the body of it. And then I mist the top, and it sort of equalizes the moisture on the top and the bottom. So it's just a typical 140-pound. I like to use Saunders Waterford, so, and it's rough, so it has a nice texture to it. Saunders Waterford rough. All right. Scoot this up and over, get it all the way into the screen for everybody. So yeah, we might as well. So I don't, on these little ones, I don't normally sketch, but I have a lot of experience, and I don't always need to sketch these natural shapes. But I want to sort of show you guys where things are going to fall. So I know this isn't a dark pencil, but you're going to see me drawing some lines, and I'm hoping that's going to help. So here's where one stone's going to go. Up over here. And I know it looks like I'm drawing with a magic pencil that doesn't make marks, but but the goal is not to make really dark marks. And then there's going to be a second little stone over here. And then everything else is going to be greens. Everything else is going to be greens. And this is going to, you'll see this in a moment. It's going to pop out as I drop in my first batch of color. So I'm going to start with my cad lemon and cobalt teal, cobalt turquoise light. And it's like a PG 50 is what the pigment color name is. And they're just mixing up a little puddle. And the reason I'm starting with the grass is that the grass is going to be, I think, the more complex shape that's going to require the most wet into wet work and layering and such. The stones should be simpler. So I'm adding more cadmium yellow because I want it to, I'm going back and forth on the little mixing line between these two pigments. I need it to be more yellow, more vibrant. This is, whatever I'm putting in now is as bright as it's going to get. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to add a touch of cad yellow light because I'm going to get it even warmer. Here is the top of that stone. I'm painting the stone negatively. And I'm painting with a light touch with my mop, and that's letting me have little speckles. And I'm gonna let those little speckles ride. I don't want to lose them. And I'm gonna get a little bit more cad yellow light because I want it to be not just limey, I want it to be warm, right? Whatever I'm doing now, this is what I'll be preserving later, right? This is going to be as vibrant as it's going to get. And of course, unfortunately, it looks more vibrant on the screen, in my opinion, always than it does in person. But you'll see that at the end when I'm able to post it. So, right, I'm always thinking I'm painting forwards, but planning backwards. So thus is the life of a watercolor artist. And I'm dropping these in, and I'm going to start to develop little variations now. So for example, I'm going to take this color that's on my brush, and I'm going to add a little burnt sienna to it. Right? So I'm using my rubber band, I'm pulling it over. We're getting kind of like a yellow ochre color. And I'm going to drop that in to some of these areas in here. There's little, like, it's not a grass or it's a dried out grass. It's some sort of weed. And I'm going to come in here. And then I'm going to go back. I clean off the brush. I'm going to go back into my mix. I want more cad lemon and cad yellow. So I've got this kind of clean, pretty clean lemony green. And down here, I'm going to add a little more of this cobalt turquoise light. And I want to have, it's still going to be vibrant and it's still going to be pale. But we're going to, it won't be anything like the darkness that we're going to drop on this in a little bit. So it looks neon on the screen in front of me. Now don't forget, and honestly, here in front of me, it is also too vibrant, but that's okay, because if it looks right when we're painting it, it's not right, right? It's always going to dampen off. That's one of the things that happens with watercolors, right? It's not oils. So I'm always pushing it a little bit, and then it always fades back into something that I think, oh, that's just about right. So at this stage, I'm going to tilt my board, and some of this water that's collecting at the bottom is going to drain off. And I have my tissue. I like to wipe the edges of my paper. It helps capture some of that extra water so that it doesn't bleed back in too much onto the painting. There we go. Right, the goal is to somehow magically have somehow magically have the paper be saturated, but not have it creeping around the edges. That's tough to do. So it just is what it is. Now I can't paint my stones right now because they are also pale, but they are a complementary. Well, they're going to be blues, right? They're going to be grays and blues. So if I do that now, it'll just disperse into all these highlights that I'm creating of the grass against the rock. So they're two separate shapes. So this is almost like I don't know, a house in a landscape, right? We can't paint it right now. We have to wait. This backdrop has to dry. Then we paint inside the shape. These are almost like two. This is almost like a separate painting hiding inside of this bigger painting, right? That's how you have to think of it, because technically speaking, because that's how we keep our shapes separated from each other. It's easy when these shapes are really dark, and I can just go on top of what's underneath, and I can, paint a tree trunk, and it's something that's really dark on top of the background. But since it's also pale, that's going to complicate things. So at this phase, it's really playtime. I can do almost anything I want in here with my greens. And it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just, it's really hard to make mistakes. The mistake that people most often make is that they're not being flamboyant enough with their application in this first stage, right? Everything's going to calm down. Everything's going to get darker on top of this. And if my initial application of paint and color isn't vibrant enough, then I'm going to lose that light. So I'm going to mix up some more of this cobalt turquoise light and a little bit of the cad light. It's going to be a darker, more muted green than what I was getting before. And I'm just going to play, right? This is a nice time to splatter, paint, create texture. If I'm going to do the technique where I use spittle, that would be, these kind of times are the times to do it. I'm going to grab some Viridian and a little ultramarine blue, right? Now, Viridian and ultramarine blue are way down on the color wheel, close to the blues. So anything that I mix between Viridian and ultramarine blue is going to be a cool blue-green. And all I'm going to do is I'm just trying to capture a little bit of texture, because when I come back in, I'm going to be doing the shadows, but I'll be doing that with the brush. And sometimes it's really hard to get convincing modeled experiences, which is what the texture of the grass is going to be if I'm just painting with my brush. So I like splattering. I think it's fun, but also it gives me effects that are interesting, that are hard to do. So I can see in my photo in this corner down here, there's like a warm, sparkly brown leaves. So I'm actually going to lift up this a little bit with my tissue. And I'm going to take this mix down here. I'm going to add some ultramarine. It's not ultramarine blue, it's burnt sienna. And little bit of this yellow. I have quite a warm yellowy brown, pretty vibrant yellow ochre. I tilt my brush in the direction that I want the splatters to go. And generally speaking, they go that way. And, you know, it's a process of a little back and forth. There we go. So just like when I was talking in the blog, you know, at this stage, two sort of things are happening. One is that, of course, I'm putting in these kind of limey greens, but it's also about value, because these limey greens are also going to be all of my highlights. So, you know, I'm thinking about what my green is. Yeah, I want to match whatever color or whatever, but I'm also thinking about the fact that these are going to be paler values, but I want to have some vibrancy. So I'm not just washing out my green and having it be pale. I'm actually grabbing a vibrant hue and I'm putting that in to get the kind of punch that we want. So this is still wet. I'm gonna go and use my blow dryer for about 20 or 30 seconds. I'll be right back. Yep, that's pretty good. So we're at this fun phase now where the surface is dry. I can feel a little tiny dampness in it, like it's cool to the touch still, but I'm not really pulling up paint anymore. And definitely it's dampened off. The color is much more muted. Still vibrant, but muted. But the paper is still wet on the back and in the body of the paper, so it's still sticking to the board and staying flat. And if I tilt it, right, the paper doesn't fall off. So it's just attached to it with water tension. And I dry the top, but the body of the paper is still wet. And wait, take a drink of coffee. So if I wasn't doing a demo, sometimes I blow the paper dry. But sometimes I just let it dry for longer. And I actually bring over a separate board and I'll actually start a second painting. And one of the reasons I like to start a second painting is it stops me from fussing, basically, right? I set it up, this is doing its thing, and you often want to correct it. Well, at least I do. I see little things and little ideas, or I want to fuss. So one of the great ways to not fuss is just to take it away from yourself. So I'll set it aside and I'll start a second painting. And oftentimes one of them isn't a great painting. Sometimes they both come out. That's a really nice pleasure, but they're not always that way. And that's fine. It's just a way to keep me painting and to sort of, you know, keep my monkey mind busy so that I'm not fussing with my painting past the point where it should be. All right. So this is good. Yeah. So I'm going to take, now what we're going to mix up are some dark greens. So now I'm going to move into ultramarine blue. And I go into my yellow. This is the yellow, cad yellow light. and this is what I use to mix greens, right? And this one is the cad yellow light, and this is what I use to mix oranges and other sorts of things like that. But the yellows are so delicate, they're so easy to get muddy that I just eventually was like, I need a different well. So we have a much darker green over here on my palette. And photos do a funny thing. If you paint in person, oftentimes these shadows are full of color. They're not really black. Photos, kind of crush your values, and you'll often get shadows that are almost black. So I don't want them to be black. They're a dark bluish green, right? The sun isn't on them yet. They're not getting hit by the direct rays of the sun in this spot where I'm going to put my shadows. And so the sky is reflecting down on them, and we have this more blue green. And of course, it's darker. There's not as much light on it. But it's also it's bluer. It's not just darker. And what we want to be careful about is, we need enough contrast in terms of hue and in terms of light versus dark, that in terms of value, that by the end of the painting, we can still see the shadows. So there are up in this area, little delicate blades of grass, and we are gonna, don't worry, they're coming in, right? I'm gonna scrape them out with my fingernail. And I find that gives a much more attractive look than trying to paint around it. So I dried this because it's a demo. If I was painting it by myself, I might be slowly letting it dry, and then you can get more wet into wet effects. So I'm taking my clean well of water, that's this one here, which I don't use for mixing, and I'm taking a new brush, and I'm delicately giving it, I'm dropping in little bits of water, because I don't want all of my edges to be harsh and all of them to be sharp. I want some variety. And then this is going to come down. I'm cutting my edge here so that I have something to paint against. I know that I need to preserve this edge that's the stone. So I cut that little edge first. And there we go. There are little, I'll show you it. It's better to just do it. So little areas that have highlights, but we did this initial wash underneath it and we let it dry. So that means it's not mixing with this new wash. So when I put the new wash on, it's pretty dark, this new application of green. And when I scrape, whatever I put on underneath reappears. So it's like it can create the experience of negative painting, or something pretty similar to negative painting, without actually, painting negatively. That can be helpful. It just allows you more ways to make marks so they don't all look the same all the time. And then up here, shadows come across. And I'm going to use my clean water and my wet brush just to give us some soft edges in here. Now, as we come in here, right, we're going to make some nuance in this. We're not going to have it all be just, you know, this highlight color and this dark shadow coming across, but they're the start. So for example, in this area over here, I'm going to take that dirty brush color I had, and over here I had some burnt sienna. So when I put in this darker value, it'll be a warmer, more muted green, right? A little closer to burnt sienna, because the burnt sienna is pulling on that little rubber band over there. So there's some sort of reflected light bouncing up into this spot. So, all right. We can't have it all be greens. It doesn't really look right. And the world isn't that way. So I want some little warm splashes of color mixed in to give it the kind of variety that gives it truthfulness. And then it's pretty dark here around the stone. The stone is casting a little cast shadow this way. And I'm getting more ultramarine blue. I want it to be darker, right? Because the blue is a darker hue, darker value, but I also want it to be cool. So I bring it in over to this edge of the stone. And now we get to start playing with more different kinds of edges as we come into this area down in here. Because it can't all be dark or it won't be interesting. We need more contrast. All right. So I'm using a bit of the belly of the brush when I'm painting. I'm not just using the tip like a pencil. And when I use the belly of the brush, I can get, you know, a variety of marks because the hair is sort of, well, it's brushing against the edge of the paper. All right. Once again, I'm going to come in with my clean water, daub off my brush, and I can't do too many strokes like this because if I do, the paint that I'm moving around will get on the brush, and then I'll have a dirty brush and I'll actually be applying color instead of moving it with the water. Over here, where I made that accidental mark, is another shadowy area, right? This stone is casting a little shadow into here. So I'm going to drop this in as well. What's going to happen as I move along on this little painting is we sort of started with the palest values and, right, the most vibrant, warmest hue, which is this limey green, yellowy green color. And now I'm dropping in, of course, the darker shadows, right? But then we're going to go back in here and we're going to kind of carve out more and more nuance until we think, oh yeah, that's telling the story that I need it to tell. So this would be fine as a little sketch, but I'm going to play with it a little bit, show you guys what I'm talking about. We're going to insert middle values that are going to help sort of massage these two values and drop them together. So, all right. There's a little, like a divot in the land here where it's dark, where it's got a little shadow being cast. You can see into the kind of underbelly of the grass. And this is great. It's a nice leading line. It takes me over and sort of zings me around inside of the composition. So I'm not just flat, I'm moving around a little bit and it's guiding my eye up. And I'm making my way down. Okay. I'm mussing it up too. I don't need it to be too perfect. Here in the foreground, it really is almost black. So I'm mixing up a very dark green. It's got ultramarine blue and cad yellow light in it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add burnt sienna to it. I'm going to pull the mix across the color wheel, right? Just like I talked about in the post, we're kind of pulling the rubber band and it's getting it darker, more muted. I'm adding in more blue in it. I want it to be a dark, cool green, really dark, but still green, almost black though. This is a good start. So what I'm going to do, I'm drying off the brush because I want to make little brush marks and I don't need it to fill the space where I'm making the mark. I just want it to sort of brush across the surface of the paper. If there's too much paint and water on the brush, of course, it fills the space up. I'm going to get my spritzer. And I'm going to get some spritzing on here. I'm not too close. If you get really close with it, you just basically flooding that area and all the paint goes everywhere. So I am very gently doing it from far away. I'm over here. And I'm making little speckles here on the paper. And some of this will gently run, but it's also going to let me play again with some splattering, and we're going to start to get some shadows in here from the splattering. And then you'll see the effect we're going to get that is going to happen because the paint I'm applying to the paper is mixing up into these little speckles that are everywhere. So it's not a complete application of water. If I did, everything would just run, which is not what I want. I want little organic shapes that are coming from splattering the paint. And I can't get those shapes if I use my brush, right? Because the brush will apply too much pigment. So in here are little vibrant areas that are green and they're not super dark. So I'm going to take my cobalt turquoise light again, way over here, right on the edge of the screen for you guys. And I got my cadmium lemon, and I have a color that is definitely cleaner. It is a cleaner green, right? Purer green, less in the middle of the color wheel, but it is much darker than this chartreuse that I was using before. And so if I come in here, it's going to let me have little middle values that are somewhere in between being a super bright highlight and a shadow, because it's going to be a middle value. We're just trying to get that texture of what it means to have this mottled grass. So this is drying. Let me see if it's too late. Nope. There we go. So I want to get little highlights that are going to, bless you, that are in here. These are the grasses, little grass blades. I got to be careful that the strokes aren't all going this way, or it looks really odd, like there's a wind blowing. So I have to think about the direction in which I apply the stroke. And what'll happen here is obviously I'm scratching out little highlights, right? And I'm going to attach these highlights to little dark shadows that'll cross over the forms in other spots. Like here, it's a highlight. And then here, maybe it'll be a little dark streak across this stone later. So we'll have a shape that is going to be passing from being in light to being in shadow. And right now, I'm basically just creating the upper half of these little shapes. And so I have to plan enough in advance to preserve these little highlights. Although I'm not really preserving them. But the truth is, I mean, I'm scratching them out, right? But the truth is that if I don't scratch these out now, I cannot scratch them out later. So it is time sensitive. There we go. All right, that's the beginning of this spot in here. And there are also little grasses and things in here as well. Little subjects like this are interesting. They're almost about nothing. It's just a couple of rocks in a meadow. And we have to figure out how we want to move the eye through it and what kind of story we're going to tell, right? So it's all about creating contrast in the subject. And that's really what's going to make it be interesting or not interesting. So this is all still wet in here, right? I spritzed it with the bottle. This up here is slowly drying. I was able to do the little scratch marks because it's drying. If I do the scratch marks too early, they'll actually, it's still wet and basically it'll become a dark mark. So, ooh, that was much more brown than I thought I had on my brush. So I'm grabbing some ultramarine blue. There we go. And I'm going to grab this perylene green. So the perylene green is, like I said, a really dark green. Now, if I take this color and I add a little water, I spread it out, just to say, stay there, little brush. It's green. It's a very muted, dark gray green. When it's thick, it gets blacker and blacker. The paler we make the wash, the more the green comes out. You can see it a little bit more and a little bit more. So this is actually a green, but it's real dark. So what I'm going to do is grab a little brush and we're going to drop little dark, they're like anti-highlights, right? The problem right now is this is very flat. So while it's still like a tiny bit wet, I move in with these darker greens to go inside the shadows, right? These are even darker. And I can daub off the brush so that it doesn't carry too much water. And I can actually paint around those scratches that I made to kind of accentuate the contrast that I created. And there's like a little dot in here, a little piece that's extra dark. Up here, we have a section that's extra dark. So of course, if I took a photograph of this, this is obviously a darker value. And it is, but it's also a cooler hue. So we're working both with, we're trying to work with hue and value at the same time if we can. That often will make the greens more compelling as I move around the color wheel a little bit. Using the side, the belly of the brush again, to sort of graze the texture of the paper, right? And then up here, I'm painting around that little scratch mark from earlier. I'm going to use this super dark area here to create a little scratch. Right, the darker it gets, definitely the stronger when you lift paint, the stronger it is, right? It starts to get more, and the contrast becomes more bold. So the technique works better. There we go. So you want some sort of nuance back in there. And I'm going to take this super dark mix and add a little more blue to it. We're going to come in here and do a similar process to what we did before. And this is going to, when we drop this in, it'll really help the light communicate what's going on, because it's going to be accentuating the directionality of the light. So I'm grabbing this blue. We have a blue-green again, but it's very thick here, and I'm using a small brush. So that means when I drop these little, they're not highlights. I actually don't know what we call them. They're like the opposite of a highlight, little dark bits. And when I drop them in, they sort of stay in place. They have a soft edge because I'm dropping them into a wet area that's like a damp area. And so they'll hold their shape a little bit, but not sort of dominate the painting, which is what I like. And over here, so we have these darker recesses within the shadows. They're a bluer, darker green. And I have a few more to do down in here, right? We're just creating little layers within layers. So I'm grabbing more of the ultramarine blue. These are little pieces to help us create that feeling that there's a depth within the spaces that we've already separated out from each other, right? That's the goal. So we have a variety of value and a variety of hues. And then let's grab, after I get this little corner done, we're going to grab some warm colors and we're going to warm this up a little bit. Okay. So I want to shift this hue a little bit, and I want to knock it back a little bit. So what I'm going to do is grab my green. I had this green over here from earlier that is clean, vibrant, but not as yellow as this. I'm going to take my small brush, daub it off so it doesn't have too much pigment, and I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to just knock this back a little bit. Little bit punchy for me. And not everything is 100% light versus 100% shadow, right? So I want some variance in this. And you can get something, and I feel that this is the case here, something that's just a little too vibrant. And then, well, tells a different kind of story. It's this weird story of this super vibrant stuff. So what I'm going to do here is right now, this really pretty clean and vibrant green that I have here, it's going to be the shadow color. Oops. It's going to be the shadow color in this highlight area, right? So down in here, it's practically a highlight, but up in here, because of the context, it's a vibrant, bright shadow, basically is what's going on, right? And what it's going to help me do is preserve these little edges as highlights and kind of make the highlights become highlights so that they're not so dominant. So we have now this little rim of a warmer yellow, and it makes more sense now because I'm dropping in this clean, vibrant green that is a green. It's definitely not hitting chartreuse or something. And I'm using the same mixing line. So it's cobalt turquoise light and cadmium lemon, right? But now I have more cobalt turquoise light, so I'm pulling it across over towards that more of a green blue. And that's giving me this, what is it? Now a shadow color, even though it's the same two pigments. That's a little better. Okay. Yeah, that's a little better. And so like I was saying before, I started off with the most vibrant I could possibly have. And then I drop in, you know, a pretty dark. And then basically I spend a reasonable portion of the rest of the painting sort of massaging the values between those two experiences to help create whatever level of nuance I want to create. So I've mixed up a muted green, not as dark though as the super dark space. And, you know, I'm just noodling around a little bit. And I'm waiting a little bit for this area up there to dry so that this stone will not dissolve into the top portion of the painting. Let's see. And I'm gonna wait to do more there. This is grass that's going to be standing in front of this little stone. And actually this dark value comes across and connects. You can see this now. Did you guys have any questions at this point? Either about the workshop or the greens I'm using, or I don't know, composition?
What kind of brushes are you using?
That's a great question. So I have a mix, and in the beginning, I'm often using a giant mop. And then I painted all my greens with a slightly smaller mop. This one's a Da Vinci. This one is from a company called Rekab, R-E-K-A-B. You can get it from a store called the Italian Art Store. I think it's in New Jersey or somewhere on the East Coast. So I have two mops. Mops are mops. You can find lots of great mops in the world. Then I was using this Chinese calligraphy brush. So what I love about this brush, I got it from Etsy, is it can be a flat, right? I can turn it on its edge, or I can roll it and it'll come to a point, or I can splay it and it has a lots of organic shape to it, like the bristles splay out. So this is a wonderful brush, one of my favorite little brushes. It's not particularly expensive. And then these brushes are synthetics, And they're both Escoda Perlas, P-E-R-L-A. You're welcome. And I have a 12 and a 6. One's like a 1/4 inch, and one is an 1/8 of an inch. And I use them for water, for spreading water. I was using this for spreading water earlier, this one, but it also can be used for little details, right? They have a nice fine point. So, and that's pretty much all I need. It definitely gets the job done. I don't have to go farther than that. And I could probably use even fewer, but it is nice to have some variety. So I'm taking ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, which if you've painted, you know, makes a great dark. And then I'm mixing it up with that green that I had in the corner. And I'm just dropping in more super dark values, right? This is about as dark as it's going to get. And daub off my brush, right? Same old story. I use the belly of the brush again. That's why it's capturing the texture here. And yeah, this is looking pretty good on the side over here. So the next thing I want to do for these greens is I was going to warm them up, right? So there we go. I'm using the belly of the brush still, right? To use the texture of the paper to greater effect. Let's see. And then, well, somebody, we can hear you. I don't know who you are, but your speaker is on. All right. I want to warm this up with some browns. So I'm going to take this slightly larger brush. And of course, I'm waiting to do these 2 boulders. So, and this is why I did the grass first, just to say, because I knew that the grass was the most sophisticated piece of this subject. And if I did the boulders first, then I was going to have to wait for them to dry in order to do all this wet into wet work on the grasses. So I've mixed up a kind of a brown. I added a little burnt sienna to the subject, to the color that was there. I'm just warming up this foreground with little daubs and dashes. I want to get some variety of hue in here. But it was a cute, sunny little alpine meadow. That's really what it was. And it was all green and luscious. That was the joy of it. I don't want to fill it in too much. I don't want to make it too brown because it wasn't. I think that's part of the story of this little subject. I'm going to get my little thin brush again. And I'm actually going to take a little yellow and cad orange and burnt sienna. And I'm making like a thick, vibrant yellow ochre again. And I'm just going to paint with this wet into wet in these shadows a little tiny bit using just the tip. And these are little highlights or, you know, reflected light. It's hard to say exactly what it is. But it also is sort of massaging the values in here and the hues, integrating a little bit of warmth into these. All right. It is a little 10 past 10. So I want to move into these boulders and we'll move towards finishing this little demo. So the boulders, I'm going to clean off this blue area. It's got green in it. Mostly clean. And the boulders are blue because they're in shadow. but it's a muted blue. And I'm adding some burnt sienna to it, right? Which is a really common mixing line. So that should be something that you guys are used to using. And then I just start to daub in my little shapes. And of course, my goal here is to, and I'm using the belly of the brush again. When I use the belly of the brush to make a mark, that's what lets me have dry brush marks that work really well. So I'm using this, primarily to create the sensation of light. That's what I'm all about here. The light is coming from the left, and there's a little form to these stones. So they have a little story to tell. So this is a pretty muted blue, but it's definitely not a warm gray. It's a cool gray. And yep, this comes all the way down. In here. And it starts to tell the story of the light. It helps the grass. I'm painting a couple of these blades of grass negatively. So anything that's a highlight in here, I have to be very thoughtful about keeping it, because really this is a big rock face that's all dark, right? I don't want it to be too mottled. I keep the little spots in the rest of the painting because they're little daubs of sunshine. But in here, I'm daubing off my brush on my rag so that I can lay down the belly of the brush, and that lets me get little dry brush marks. Can't have too much pigment on it. So that's going to dry for a little bit, and I'm going to have gently soft little edges where it is bumping up against what was the greens, but that's okay, right? It's looking good. I'm going to mix up more of this ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And my little puddle ran out. And I need to do this stone over here. So on this stone, there's a little seam of light that hits the edge of the stone. So I cut my edge, right? So I'm protecting this important little edge because it's definitely helping to tell the story of the direction of the light. And then the stone has kind of a little top, almost like it could be a bench. So I cut that edge too. And then I come and I start to just fill in this lower area. Now, actually, in this middle spot, we have little highlights that are the grass. So what I'm going to do is come down. I'm going to daub off the brush, use the belly of the brush. I'm making little rough edges. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do yet, but I want to preserve little bits of light. This will let me paint in other things later. There we go. That will make the grass sing in that little area. Now, one of the nice things that's fun about this little subject for me is in here, there's this grass that's here, right? It's behind the boulder, but actually the grass is casting little cast shadows across the surface of the boulder. They're pale because there's more reflected light coming in. Definitely casting little shadows, and that's interesting to me. There we go. Now, just like we were doing before, right? I have my lightest value for the boulders, which is the white, and I have my darker value, which is, obviously the shadows that I just dropped in. So what I'm going to do though now is start to sort of massage the middle values into it. So, and then also if there are like super dark little drops, I'm going to put the little dark, super dark drops in there too. So, whoops, come back. There we go. So, I'm going to mix up an even bluer blue. It's like a, it's not a pure ultramarine blue, but it's pretty blue. And I'm going to drop some of this into the shadows to give it a little bit of a pronounced coolness, right? I want it to feel obviously not brass-like. And I want it to tell this story of the cool shadows in the morning. That'll be wet into wet. There we go. And I'm also going to make up, I'm making up a really dark, thick application. So I have this little brush. And so when I make my mix, the little brush barely carries any water. So I go over to a corner where there's no mixture. So I'm not adding any water into this. And then I'm taking my ultramarine, my burnt sienna, and I'm mixing it together in the corner with my little brush, which is also not adding any water. And I'm trying to get this nice dark blue, almost black. There we go. And I'm going to come in here and, you know, this has got like lichen on it, probably is what it was. And I'm just going to add a little bit of life to the shadows of the stone, right? You want it as its own little story where we have variety and in the values on it. Looking a little bit at my photo, get a little inspiration. And little speckles. Sometimes this would be something I might splatter also, or spit on it. And it works. If it works, good enough for me. I have such a hard time getting it to work anyways. I don't fuss over, I don't know whether it's hygienic. So this area in the stone, it's definitely dark in here. And that's part of what's helping the light areas tell their story. And I also want to kind of bond the stone's dark shadows to the dark shadows of the grass, right? So we don't have them sort of sticking out on top of it. I want them to be connected. I can hear somebody's in there, and you accidentally have your speaker on. All right. Yeah, this is coming together. Yeah, a little sketch. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to blow it dry here for just about 20 seconds. And then we're going to come in with some opaque applications, and they can go over the top of some of these dark values, and they'll connect different shapes together. So these stones have to become dry, and then I can paint on top of them without it mixing in. So just give me a second, and we'll come in and we'll wrap up this little demo. All right, we're back in action. So at this stage, it's the last little piece of the puzzle. I can scratch little details in, and I can add little, because it's still gently moist, and I can add in little highlights. So I am not above using highlights at all. I think it's a super valuable and useful tool. So that is not going to be bright enough. So what I need is a white. So I've got here some titanium white. I put it on my palette. This is not an uncommon part of the process for me. So I've got my little blob of white here, and I'm going to grab some cad lemon. I want to make a vibrant yellowy lemon. And then I'm going to add a little bit of cad yellow light, and then I add in my white. So when you add a white in, it tends to make it cooler. It's a blue white. And whatever it looks like on the screen, it's a little bit cloudy and cool in reality. So I have to add in some cad lemon, kind of warm it up. That looks better. And then I'll apply this with this little brush. The little brush, once again, does not carry very much water. And that really helps it. So in go some of these little highlights. And I like to think of this kind of like weaving. We are weaving these highlights into the dark shapes. And before, when I was talking about taking these dark shapes from the rock, the shadows in there, and then trying to, weld the dark shape to the light shape, it's the same exact process, right? I want to integrate these shapes so that I can travel between them with my eye. So this is definitely a pale, warm yellow. So just like before, right? If it's going to catch the sunlight, I need it to be a warm yellow. It can't be too cool, or it'll look pretty weird that we have this highlight that is actually a cool highlight. You can have those, they exist, but they wouldn't in this one where we have a direct sunlight hitting, healthy young grass. So this stage is all basically dry brush work because I'm adding these highlights on. And, there's more highlights in, I'm getting just a tiny bit of water on the brush. There's more highlights in the photo than there are in my painting. I have to be thoughtful about not going crazy with the highlights. But my philosophy about things like these highlights is I would rather preserve the beauty of a wash and have, right, which watercolors do so fantastically well, and then come back in and do some highlights, then I would somehow try to cut around all these little edges. And right, I just, to me, that's a kind of painting process that I think leaches the joy out of painting with watercolors. I want juicy little, perfect washes, and then I can come in and do the rest of this. Let's see. So it is nearing 10:30, and we'll finish up here probably in the next 5 minutes. That looks about right.
Steve,
And yes.
I missed the very, very beginning due to some logging on logistics. What information has been given out about the workshop on greens coming up?
Yep. So I actually haven't talked about it yet. It was just what I was thinking. It's time to talk about the workshop
Okay.
as I finish it out. So the workshop, I'm gonna tomorrow I will post this little painting and the Zoom recording to the blog. And by the way, here I'm grabbing a little more water again. And I'll post them to the blog. And when I do, I'll open up the cart for folks to sign up for the workshop who would like to come in. My goal for the workshop is we're going to have 6 hours of instruction. We'll go from 9:30 to 4:30 Pacific Standard Time. And we're going to go over pigments. We need to get your pigments on your color wheel so that you can start making mixing lines. I'm going to do some mixing lines myself. And for some folks, if you haven't done swatches before, for example, to really understand what you're going to mix and how you can get a third color in there, we're going to play around with that a little bit because I find that super instructional. We're going to work on that. We're going to do a couple of demos where we start applying information, applying the greens. We're going to do the demos. And then we're also going to talk about value, color has value. So there's more to talk about with that. I just kind of scratched the surface in the blog post because it's just a blog post. I can't go on forever. And, there are other tools at our command that we can use with the green. So there's contrast of value, there's contrast of hue, there's contrast of temperature, which is what we're talking about a lot here, where I was talking about how do we use color to create light, not just value, right? We want to move across the color wheel to create that kind of temperature, the story of the temperature. But there's also, for example, contrast of chroma. So where we talk about where we have muted areas and where we have really vibrant areas. And by having vibrant areas, that'll draw the eye into that space as well. So, the greens that we're going to be using all work in cohort with each other. And that's part of how they're going to tell the story for us. So definitely we'll be using other contrasts to explore how to use the greens as well. So, and of course, we'll have, we can do Q&A, which is hard to do when we're just doing like a little 1.5 hour Zoom demo. So the class will be $97 for the full day workshop, and you'll have access to the recordings for a month afterwards. So if you want to rewatch it, you guys will get the secret YouTube link, and I'll send it along to you guys, that private link. And you guys can, I've done workshops like that myself, and I found having the YouTube video useful. I did rewatch stuff, and I was glad I did. So having said all of that, I didn't know if you had additional questions. Maybe I missed something. I often do. I'll take that as a no.
Oh, I was going to ask you, what day of the week is this going to be?
Oh, sorry. Yes, that would be important. So it is next Saturday, which is the 27th.
Oh, okay, great.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah. So unfortunately, since we live on a round planet, it's incredibly difficult to meet the needs of people in a place like Australia, while I simultaneously meet the needs of people in Europe. It's just time-wise, what am I going to do? So I know that unfortunately that is a time slot that is tough for Australians and a little better for Europeans, because they would be coming home from work and right? For Americans in California, it's easy peasy, it's the morning. And if you're on the East Coast, then it'll be like starting at 12:30 and going till dinner time. So that's what I got on the workshop. And it'll cover much of what we've been talking about in this little demo and in the blog posts, right? We're just going to go farther in depth, answer more of your questions, talk about where your pigments lie, talk about what your mixing paths look like so that you can understand how to apply what you've got. You should be able to do all the things that I'm doing and have different pigments. You don't need to match my pigments necessarily. Of course you could, and that's not bad, but you don't need to necessarily, as long as you have enough diversity. And then the only way to really learn how to paint is to paint. So of course, we're going to do some demos. And then if we have the time, I'll do a crits, which we can do digitally. People email me their painting, and then I can drop it into a like Photoshop, and we can work on it digitally to see what we could change if you're having problems with it. So that is the demo for today. And that's what I got for you guys on the workshop next Saturday, the 27th. And I guess that's it for now. I'm gonna switch over to the forward-facing camera. Just to say, oh, Magdalena, did you raise your hand? Did you have a question for me?
Yes, I missed the reference.
Oh, the reference, yes. So the reference, just to say, is and pin. The reference is on the blog post. I put it in this morning. So
Okay.
you'll find it at the bottom of the most recent post, and you can check it out there.
Thank you.
Compare. Yeah. That's something that I need to remember to put into the blog post before I do a Zoom demo. Things to learn, definitely to improve. So that's not a problem. Good question. Thanks for coming, everybody. It's been a pleasure having you all be here. You've been a wonderful audience. Let me see how many folks are here. Boop. Oh, that's full screen. That's not what I want. Gallery is what I want. There you all are. All right. Thanks a lot for all of the comments in the chat. I appreciate it. And I will have this posted on the blog by tomorrow morning. Have a good afternoon, you guys, or a good evening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye. Bye, Eileen. It's nice to see you there.